So welcome everybody to our May AI Ethics talk. And today we have with us Clinton Castro, who's an assistant professor of philosophy and also director of the certificate program Intelligence and Big Data at Florida International University. His primary areas of study are information ethics, fair machine learning, and epistemology. He's recently published a book with Cambridge University Press, Algorithms and Autonomy, which is co-authored with Adam Pham and Alan Rubel. And this book examines how algorithms in criminal justice, education, housing, elections, and beyond can affect autonomy, freedom, and democracy. And today, Clinton will be talking, the title of his talk is Representative Individuals and Fair Machine Learning. So I do want to thank everyone again for joining us. There's a handout that you should have access to. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Clinton.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks very much for having me. As Debbie said, there's a handout in the chat. I think this is kind of unusual for Zoom or whatever webinar formats. I haven't done it before, but I've always wanted to give it a shot. So I'm not going to have a slideshow. I'm just going to have my handout that you can peruse, but it's not required for the talk. It's more just my notes to myself. It might help you refer back to something. It might help you to follow along. It might help you to just ignore it entirely and listen to me, whatever kind of suits you best. So again, thank you for having me. A couple of things I wanted to get out of the way before I really start is that this project is something I'm working on with Michaela Loy at Polytechnic University of Milan. So I wanted to give him credit for helping me with this project. Yeah, without further ado, here's just a little preview of the talk, and then I'll just, I guess, jump into things. So what I'm going to do here is first, I want to give a little bit of a background. I'm sure some people have a pretty substantial background in this, but just so that everybody can follow along, I want to give a little bit of a background on some of the core ideas I'll be talking about, which involve ideas like machine learning and fair machine learning and fairness measures. Then what I want to do is talk about two problems with, okay, so I'm going to be mostly focusing on things called statistical fairness measures. I'll say what I mean about that in a second. But I'm going to be focusing on two problems with statistical fairness measures in particular, although I do think that these problems also translate to other kinds. The problems in are labels I've given them are what I call the equal probabilities talk problem and the other reference class problem, which I'll be explaining what that means shortly. And then after introducing those problems, which I think will take a pretty good amount of time, I'm going to start sketching paths to solutions to those problems. So this talk is not one where I'm going to say, you know, people are trying to do fair machine learning and they're doing it all wrong, and here I am to kind of reject it all. Instead, the ultimate goal is to find a practice people are engaged in, find some wrinkles or cracks in the practice, to mix metaphors, and but then try to figure out how to smooth out those wrinkles or fill in those cracks. So at the end of the day, what I'm offering is something like a rational reconstruction of what people are doing. And so my main aim is not to like tear it down. It's instead to put it on a better foundation. That said, I think that if we adopt the proposal I'm going to be talking about, that doesn't mean that everything's going to stay the same. In fact, I think that what it'll do is help us do it a little bit better, but it's just not going to be like a radical revision. It's not like, again, it's not like I'm saying we need to tear this down and build from scratch. It's more like we need to kind of better understand what we're doing, put it on a little bit better footing, which among other things will let us do it better. If of course it works out. And at this point, I should mention that this is a work in progress. And so I'm like really excited to talk through it with some people because it's still like definitely something that's in its development. Okay, so starting with some background on fair machine learning. I think that most of us here know that fair machine learning is used for all sorts of things. I don't think I need to give much of a background on that. To set up a running example that I'll talk through, and many apologies to people who have heard this kind of example 1,000 times. And if you haven't, the really fleshed out details of the case I'm talking through there's a story about it linked in the notes. And I'm mostly just going to talk through a sort of simplified fictionalized version of it. But anyways, just to set up a running example to introduce some ideas. You might use machine learning to predict whether to give defendants bail by assessing how risky they are. You might say, well, we really don't want to extend bail to people who might commit crimes while out on bail. And so we're going to try and develop some kind of predictive system to decide who to extend bail to and who not to. Such a system might have a very good chance of being a lot more accurate, efficient, and less biased than human judges. However, it might still be unfair. For example, its error rates might be different for different groups, and that might raise questions of fairness about the system. And in the real life version that I've linked to, this is more or less what happened. A system was used. It wasn't actually a machine learning system, but we could, in my fictionalized example, we could use a machine learning system. This is more just kind of like a more like hand-coded statistical system that was used. But in any event, a system was developed to use kind of big data to make a bunch of judgments. A group of journalists looked at the kind of track record of those judgments, and they noticed a couple of things about the system. Namely, one of the things that they identified was that Black defendants that passed through the systems were more likely to be falsely identified as risky. So the system kind of penalized Black defendants in a certain kind of way, is one way of putting it. And also white defendants were more likely to be falsely identified as non-risky. And on those grounds, and in so many words, they thought that the system was unfair. I'm not going to because there's so much controversy here, and I'll come back to this in a second, this is not a talk where I'm going to say whether in this particular case, the way that they determined this was right or wrong. Instead, I kind of want to introduce this more general notion of kind of auditing or looking at these decision-making systems to determine whether they're fair, and to discuss the kinds of tools that might be thought to be good ways of measuring fairness. So that's what I'm talking about. So this is not a talk where I'm like going to adjudicate which measure to use. As intuitive as the one that I just described might sound, or like I haven't quite introduced it, but as intuitive as everything I just said might sound, this is a very complicated field. The particular measure that this group used, which I'll be discussing in more detail, is in conflict with other things that we want. And so again, I'm just going to step back on any kind of first order judgment as to whether or not this is the right way to go in particular, and more just kind of step back and think about like these ways of measuring things by looking at the kind of dispositions they seem to have with respect to groups at a kind of a macro level. Okay, so anyhow, that big caveat aside, this takes us to the idea of a fairness measure. A fairness measure is a mathematically precise definition of what it means to be fair in the context of data-driven decision-making. And one common approach is the statistical fairness measure, which looks at group-level ratios of outcomes, such as error rates across racial groups, which is like more or less what that group of journalists was looking at. Again, I'm not endorsing any particular fairness measure. That's like a whole debate. But I am going to introduce one precise example of a statistical fairness measure, just so that we can have a little bit more of a vivid understanding of the kinds of things that we're talking about. And this one that I'm going to talk about has like some popularity, even though it's controversial, just like any measure is controversial. Again, because most of the measures that we like individually, we can't have together. And anybody familiar with this is probably aware of that. But if you didn't know that, now you do. It's kind of hard to get everything you want here. Okay, so one particular example of a statistical fairness measure is what I'll call equalized odds. That's one common name for it, but the names are not super uniform here. So I'll call it equalized odds. It's pretty common to call it equalized odds. And this is the one place where if you want to, you could look at the handout. I don't think you'll have to, but I have equalized odds spelled out in symbols. And what I'll do is not just read through the symbols, but kind of talk through the formula in what I'll call sort of like quasi-English, so that it's going to be like a little stilted, but it'll give you a sense of what this thing is asking for. And then I'll go through this one more time in English. Not that this is fantastically complicated, but I think it's important to have like a sense of what this measure that we're going to be talking about as an example asks for. So if you're looking at the page, it's important to note that where the little Y with a hat appears on it, when that's mentioned, it's mentioning the prediction the system made. So like whether or not someone is thought to be risky. And where you see a Y, that represents the feature of the person. So whether they actually are in fact risky or not. And then there's these other variables, A and B, which represents their particular protected attributes. So in this example, I'll just do white and black. Okay, so now reading through the formula just a little bit. what it says is that if the system's fair, then we'll have these two kind of equalities hold. Number one, the probability that a person is determined to be risky, given that they actually are risky and, let's say, white, should be equal to the probability that they're determined to be risky, given that they are risky and black. So the first one says, basically, among the risky people, our rate at which we detect risky people should be the same for white risky people and black risky people. And so that's the first half of the formula. The second half says the probability that someone's determined to be risky, given that they're not risky and white, should be equal to the probability that they're determined to be risky, given that they're not risky and black. So again, among now the non-risky people, the rate at which we falsely detect or identify them as risky should be the same whether they're white or black. Okay, so what the formalization in effect says is that the true positive rate and the false positive rate should be in balance across, in this case, these racial groups that we've chosen. Although, of course, like the sensitive attributes that we want to control for would be probably broader than just white and black if we're talking about race. And then, of course, you would include a whole other slew of things like race and, or I'm sorry, gender, ethnicity, whatever else you think is important to keep track of. Okay. So just applying this measure to the case, as I did like totally informally when talking about what the journalists did, this would say that the system is unfair, at least in part because it has different false positive rates. It has other things going on, but it has different false positive rates. And that's enough for equalized odds to say that this is unfair. And now I want to say, like, again, I already said this stuff about these things being controversial, but I want to say now that I think to many of us, I just want to note that at first blush, not knowing about these other complications, this should seem like sort of like intuitive. I think that it seems like, again, at first instance, not knowing any further controversy about stuff, it seems reasonable to say that, well, if my chance of being falsely identified as a risky person and therefore maybe denied bail or paying a higher bail amount is elevated just because of my race, well, that seems unfair. And equalized odds kind of captures that intuition. It should equalize the odds across races because nobody should be more or less likely to be advantaged or disadvantaged in this context just because of their group membership or something like that. Okay. Now, I, of course, said at first blush there because, like I said, there's all this controversy. And now if you want, this is like maybe for later, the handout will be kept at that link for a while. And then also, I think whenever we post this, we'll put a stable PDF somewhere. You can click on some links I've put here that explain some of these further complications and some objections and these other sorts of things. But again, I'm not here to defend equalized odds. When I say at first blush it looks good, that's all I'm saying is that, hey, like there's something intuitive going on here. And I'm actually going to kind of return to that thought. So hopefully you can like, at least hopefully kind of can feel somewhat sympathetic that, okay, like this seems like a pretty common sense demand of fairness. And if you want to investigate that more, I've got a couple linked papers here for people who want to see some people that are more skeptical of equalized odds, some people that are more in favor of it. Okay, so zooming out just a little bit, I guess the last thing I want to say about this background section, hopefully now we have kind of a background, machine learning, concerns about unfairness, fair machine learning, statistical measures, equalized odds under our belts. The one thing I just wanted to mention is that some people might be wondering like, okay, well, this is like equalized odds is statistical, it's just looking at correlations, like what about causation? I just wanted to note here that I would say like the broadest and probably most popular class of measures are these statistical measures to this day, but people are developing causal measures. I'm interested in that. I think much of what I say here will extend to the causal measures, but that is a different case. And it gets us into some complications I don't think I could like totally work through in a talk of this length, but maybe in Q&A people are curious about that. It's something I'd be happy to talk about. That's something that I'm actually like actively thinking about right now is the causal case. But right now that's one reason I say I'm talking about statistical measures is because there are other kinds of measures, including ones that use causal modeling to understand fairness. Okay, so anyhow, we have our background down now. So we're in a good position to talk about the two problems that I want to talk about. And in fact, don't be surprised if this takes a while. It's going to take a little while to especially describe the first one. at least to my satisfaction, but maybe I'm being long-winded. We'll see. So the first problem right now I'm calling the equal probabilities talk problem. And let me explain that a little bit. So fairness measures, statistical fairness measures like equalized odds, the one I just talked through, are often couched in terms of equalizing probabilities. If you probably went back and played the tape of how I just talked about it, I more or less suggested or talked about how it's all about giving people even chances or something like this. And just to show that I'm not totally loading the deck and just accusing people of speaking this way without any evidence, I've got at least one example on the handout, and I'll just read through it. And I'm not picking on these people. I think that this is a very common way to talk about this stuff. And also I think it kind of shows, as I'll talk in a little bit more detail, that there's like this intuition about like giving people equal chances that we want to capture. There's something about equalized odds where I haven't quite yet described this, but it doesn't quite get you that. But I can see it makes sense that people would give it this gloss because that's kind of what we're aiming at. And I actually think that once we think through it, we can maybe reorient it so it is kind of getting what people want it to get. But without kind of further interpretation, there's a little bit of a problem. Okay, so anyhow, here's the gloss that at least one paper gives of what equalized odds is asking for. And just to note, in this example, they're talking about credit scoring as opposed to bail, but it's more or less the same thing. Just a different context. Okay, so they say equalized odds could be understood as demanding that the probability of an applicant with a good credit score to be correctly assigned a good predicted credit score and the probability of an applicant with a bad credit score to be incorrectly assigned a good predicted credit score should be both the same for male and female applicants. And on the handout, I bolded it and I tried in my voice to bold probability and applicant. And that's important because again, I think that one thing that we want to do eventually is make good on justifying these systems to people and make good on the idea that they should have more or less fair chances of being judged correctly by these systems or incorrectly. But now I'm going to kind of like show that there's a little bit of a problem here. So I'm going to talk about this from a kind of two angles. I think that there's other ways I could talk about this, but this should suffice. So here's one problem with just understanding equalized odds as getting us even probabilities. One is that equalized odds is really ultimately, even though even in my expression, most popular expressions of it in the formalism is like shown as a probability, really what it is about equalizing two ratios at the group level, right? It's about making sure that the false positive rate at the group level is equal for both, in our example, Black and white defendants, and that the false negative rate is also the same for Black and white defendants. But to say that that ratio holds at the group level is to say nothing really about the probabilities of the individuals that make up the people who get, you know, kind of added, get kind of combined into like a statistical group to determine the ratio. So for example, I mean, one thing that we could imagine is that each person had either a 100% chance of, let's say, for example, true positive or a 0% chance. And that if enough people just keep showing up, some of whom have a 100% chance and some of whom have a 0% chance, at some point we can get a group level ratio of what the true positive rate is, but that's not to say that the people had anything other than 100 or 0% chance. Now what I can add to that, and I could say more about this maybe in Q&A if people aren't really buying this, but I think it's a pretty simple point, and I think it's a correct one. And now we can kind of dramatize what I just said by adding to the fact that many machine learning systems are deterministic. So if, for example, you were going to run me through the system as to whether or not I should be granted bail or not, once you've specified the information you're going to give it to me, the thing is either going to say I'm risky or not risky with basically 100% certainty. I guess like the only probability would be if the computer breaks down while they're running it or something, but the rules are often at least firmly set, and there's really no meaningful way to talk about the probability that it gets me right. Of course, there might be some probabilities in my behavior, but also oftentimes, like as to whether or not I actually go on to be risky or something like this, maybe I have a change of heart, but oftentimes systems are used to predict things that have already happened. So for instance, in a variety of settings, you might be predicting people's ethnicity So to figure out whether or not to show them text in English or Spanish. And it's not like my ethnicity is going to change in the way that maybe I might have a change of heart about whether for live a life of crime or not. Not that it works that way, but you can probably see the point. Okay, so here's the thing. That kind of isn't the full-fledged problem, but kind of gets us in the ballpark of thinking about the problem. People want to talk. Oftentimes, people will talk about, and I think intuitively understand, equalized odds as guaranteeing even individual level probabilities, but that's just like not really what it does. And moreover, like machine learning systems oftentimes just aren't probabilistic. So there's a little bit of a tension there. At this point, and this is like actually my way of actually getting to the real problem, I think someone could say, oh, Clinton, like you're just being like a philosopher. People will sloppily talk as though that they're talking about probabilities. They're really talking about group level ratios. Who cares? Like just in your head, if you need to translate what they're saying into these group level ratio facts, and don't worry about this probability stuff. It's just them talking kind of loosely. But I don't think that that really makes the problem that I'm concerned with go away. Because the real problem that I'm concerned with was that intuition I mentioned earlier, that like people do seem to be owed kind of something like fair chances. And telling them that we've secured some kind of group level ratio really might not be a way to justify the system to them, at least not without further interpretation, right? Because the intuition that I was trying to get people to maybe feel was that there is something that we want to give people at the individual level. While if equalized odds isn't doing that, well, then it seems to maybe be the wrong tool for the job. And more generally, okay, if we have a slightly different intuition and we don't like equalized odds, well, okay, we can kind of like start to modulate for whatever we think the fairness thing that we want is and however best we think to encode that. Okay. Now, that's one way to kind of justify the problem. I want to step back a bit though and say, you don't have to share my bias for caring about individuals to notice that there's a problem here. And so let me step back and say, look, I'm not even going to try and jam that intuition down anyone's throat. Instead, what I want to say is, here's what I think is true. We have a whole community of people working on fair machine learning. Many of them feel some sympathy towards something like equalized odds or things in the ballpark of it. And furthermore, most of these people, I think, I haven't done a poll, but I think are liberals in this very broad sense, where when I say liberal, at least in this very broad sense that I'm speaking of, I mean people who care about individuals, people who care about justifying social institutions to individuals. And now, like, again, I could say, look, I'm a non-liberal. I don't share that bias. However, here are these people who I think are liberals who are trying to do this thing. And it's hard to square using something like equalized odds or any statistical measure with their kind of moral concern. And then I guess just to say like one more thing about this idea of this kind of broad liberalism is that why do I think that I'm justified in saying that? Have I spoken to these people? Have I done a survey? No, I just think that this kind of liberalism is basically the dominant paradigm for thinking about matters of social justice. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone thinks this way, but I think it's like the dominant paradigm. And so like when I stumble across the conversation of fair machine learning, I think it's, and once you read through the details as well, but I think it's just a kind of a fair assumption that people are interested in justifying things at the group level. So either if you share my concern, you should be kind of like, okay, how do I use equalized odds if I like it, or statistical measures if I like them? And then further, even if I don't, if we just kind of want to do this like kind of rational reconstruction of this practice that people are engaged in, what help can we give them? There seems to be something that's a little in need of some kind of repair here. Okay, so that's the equalized, that's the equal probabilities talk problem. Hopefully it's been made clear. Before I start talking about a way of thinking about how to solve it, I want to bring up another problem that I think is related or intertwined, or another problem that we need to solve if we want to be able to do fair machine learning with statistical measures and these other measures that I think are enough like statistical measures that they have like similar concerns. So the next problem I'm going to talk about is something that I call, for now, the other reference class problem. And that's kind of a funny name, probably. I'm assuming most people here or some people here are familiar with the reference class problem. So I'm calling this the other reference class problem to distinguish it from the reference class problem, where simply put, the reference class problem just is a general problem of determining which class an event belongs to. So if you want to assign a probability to something, you have to locate it in a class, right? Maybe a quick and simple example would be if you wanted to guess the color of my house. If you wanted to assign a probability to its being green, you're gonna have to kind of come up with some set of color categories and have a sense of how much weight to give them. But let's just pretend you're gonna kind of treat them as all having equal weight, because you're just gonna pretend that you're totally ignorant about houses in Miami and how people color them. Well, if you're gonna be kind of indifferent across the color categories, you still need to have a set of color categories. You could reach for like the Crayola 8 color set, or the 16 or 32 or 64 or whatever, and that is like gets you in the mood, hopefully, for seeing that, like, oh yeah, you have to kind of make a choice here, and how you define the colors could, at least in certain circumstances, wiggle what probability you end up assigning. There's like an influence there. And so that's the general kind of reference class problem. The other reference class problem, just as a special instance of the reference class problem, in the context of trying to do fair machine learning. And you might reasonably ask, okay, so why even treat those as different or something? Well, one hope I have for the other reference class problem, I don't have much hope for the reference class problem, is that because it's a special version of it in a special context, you might be able to exploit features of the context in order to get some traction there. So that's kind of like why I set them apart, is there might be enough of a context in the other reference class problem cases where we can grab onto some features of the context to get a little bit more to work with than we could for like trying to devise some kind of general solution to the reference class problem. A couple quick comments on why I think the other reference class problem matters, and why I think it's hard. I think it matters because the classes that you locate people in are going to influence what probabilities you assign them of having like a true positive or a false negative or whatever. And so it's something you have to think about if you want to do this. And I think it's hard because it's just genuinely hard to know what groups to put people into. So I use this example of applied to myself as whether to classify me, whether to try to understand my likelihood of getting a false positive or true negative or whatever, whether you classify me as Latino or Cuban American. Those are not the same. The ratios might be different. And if they are, you could have a serious kind of question of like, well, for the purposes of this occasion, which one should we use? The Cuban American one might carry more information and might get closer to my actual chances. However, you might think that to the extent that there's any discrimination to worry about, it might not be so fine-grained that people are discriminating against Cubans, but that they're instead discriminating against, for example, people that speak Spanish, and then maybe you might prefer to categorize me as a Latino instead of a Cuban American. Hopefully that makes sense. So like, which of those should we use? I mean, it's an open question. It's kind of hard. And there's other kinds of interesting questions to be asked there. Ones that I can't fully settle in this talk, but hopefully just kind of bring that out and center as something that we have to think about probably pretty carefully. One quick note I'll make, actually I wish I would have linked this in the handout. The Pew Research Center has a really cool kind of graphical tool where you can see how the US Census categories have changed. And I think that's a cool way to kind of look at, oh yeah, we can go fine-grained, coarse-grained. There's a lot of different ways of describing the sorts of categories that we want to use for these purposes, and they've changed a lot over time. Okay, so the second problem is maybe a little bit more easy to describe. It is the problem of determining which categories to put people into for the purposes of fair machine learning. And realizing that there's just kind of hard choices to be made. Okay, so now let me start talking about my framework for solving these problems. And I think I have about at least 10 minutes to go. So I think we're doing great on time so far, but I might have to speed up a bit. So our framework for coping with these problems is inspired by John Rawls. So let me say just a couple of quick things about John Rawls. Even though we're not really like taking on a bunch of Rawlsian baggage here, it's just actually he did this thing in Theory of Justice that seems to us like a neat thing to have done that could work in this context. So if people do have kind of affiliations in political philosophy, at the end of the day, I actually think that this proposal, our goal is to be like not super committal about anything about political philosophy. There's just kind of a neat widget Rawls has that I think might help us here. And that can be, I think, taken from his system like without taking a lot else on. Okay, so Rawls saw justice as a system, as a property of a system of rule, as opposed to just the outcomes that it produces. Just to introduce a quick example as to why you might think that those are things you might be able to pull apart. I got this example of a lottery. So you can imagine that we have a lottery that's going to have one drawing and multiple winners, and that men and women sign up in equal numbers. And then we like do our one run of the lottery, and the split of the winners is not 50-50 men, women. I don't think that any of us would conclude that there's unfairness yet, just on the basis of the outcome. There could be unfairness, but it's also possible with a fair lottery to have like a kind of uneven distribution because of basically luck and chance. So like if we wanted to think about the fairness of the system, we'd have to think about its average behavior in some kind of way. Maybe we could do a bunch of hypothetical runs, like Bernoulli trial sort of stuff, or something else, think about its mechanisms, whatnot. But the basic idea here is that for some cases, you kind of want to abstract away from actual outcomes and look at a system's kind of overall behavior to understand its fairness. So Rawls, instead of asking, when talking about fairness and social justice, instead of asking how does a social institution impact each individual person in our population, he asked, how does the institution affect representative social positions, sort of like as a system that's kind of that like reiterates, sort of like my lottery example. And so more generally, when evaluating institutions, he thought not about the actual individuals that occupy social positions, but instead individuals who are representative of those social positions considered as such and abstractly. We want to take a similar approach to fair machine learning. And in fact, I think that this is a kind of natural approach, because oftentimes, like when you want to test, when you want to like validate a system, you do with it kind of what I explained that you do with the lottery. Although oftentimes your goals are to just try to ensure that it's accurate enough for your purposes as opposed to being fair. But let's just suppose we take this approach on, and now instead of saying the system is fair if it gives Clinton even chances as someone else, and instead ask, does a sort of abstractly characterized version of Clinton have appropriate chances, or the similar chances as somebody else abstractly described? And one thing that can happen immediately if we take this approach is talking about probabilities suddenly makes sense again, because the features of me that make me a particular person, that make the kind of outcome deterministic for me, just don't hold for the unrepresentative individual. And for the representative individual that represents me in the system, you know, you can have a conversation about how you assign probabilities to them, but one thing that seems sensible to me is to take something like a frequentist approach and say, okay, like what is the representative person? Let's just say, for this is like probably way oversimplified, but the representative person might just be, okay, let's just go with like the Latino, right? And like a man that represents me that is also Latino, and you could just like look at how all the Latino men are fair in the system, and you can say, okay, that's the probability that the representative person for the Latino population faces. And so like one thing is just on its face, talking about probabilities starts to make sense again. There's like no incoherence in that. And so we reorient the system as thinking not about my actual particular individual chances, but instead the chances of my appropriately characterized representative in the system. Now, I could see somebody say, okay, well, that's a okay way to rescue the talk of probabilities, but what about this whole thing, this whole spiel you did with liberalism? And to that, I have two responses. So someone could say, okay, fine, you fix the boring part, but like, how does this, and it sounds like you're just talking about groups again and not talking about individuals. And here's my response. The first one is like a little bit, I wouldn't quite say sarcastic, but maybe like a little bit funny, is that Rawls just is the paradigmatic liberal. So like if we're using his methods, like, how could we not be liberals? That's like sort of a joke, but I mean, it's actually not. I mean, it actually doesn't. It seems to me like actually like an okay argument. But the other thing, and a little bit more seriously, is that I think that this is liberal because what we're trying to do is kind of explain that institutions are giving me what is owed to me as an individual, which I would take involves kind of explaining if the system is fair or just, that I have like a satisfactory chance at a satisfactory outcome given my social position. And this representative individual approach is just one way to construct such an explanation. To say, look, I can't even really talk about your individual level probabilities, but what I can say is that somebody like like a thing that represents your social position, this like abstract individual, faces the same chances that all other relevant social positions, has the same chances of a good or bad outcome as all other social positions. And that's a way of kind of saying, like, well, then that kind of shows that you are being given what you're owed as an individual by society, that you're kind of facing fair chances or something like that. Okay, so that's one way to start to broach the issues of the equal probability talk problem, both from the point of view of just talking about probabilities in a way that makes a little bit more sense, I think, or at least isn't incoherent, and then also by talking about how it's like actually got some moral import. However, we still have to get back to the other reference class problem, which I'm going to have to rip through pretty quickly, but I think I can deal with very quickly. First, I'll make a quick detour, and then I'll just talk through some of our ways of coping with the other reference class problem from this point of view. The first thing I just wanted to mention really quickly that I just think is neat about this approach, not to pat ourselves on the back too much, is that I think that this way of thinking about machine learning systems and fairness in machine learning systems cakes in some lessons or bakes in some lessons from like intersectionality that I think are important to learn and not overlook. And it kind of it creates a system that learns those lessons kind of automatically, I think, or at least some of the lessons. So imagine you take our approach, and let's just suppose you're going to be talking about defendants, Black and white, men and women. As a prominent example from kind of intersectionality shows, you can have a system that's fair when you look at just men and women. Men are not favored, women are not favored. Fair when you look at Black people and white people. Black people are not favored, white people are not favored. But then it could still be compatible with all those facts that a subset that intersects those two groups, those two kind of cross-cutting distinctions, Black women are treated unfairly, right? So if you take an approach where you're not talking about representative individuals, you might make that kind of mistake. But if you take our approach, I think that one way to think about this is you could say, okay, is this system fair? Okay, yes, it is. Maybe the person would say, because here's your representative. And you could say, well, that person either does or doesn't represent me. But if they do, and let's say you're a Black woman, you can say, okay, well, my representative is a Black woman. And if the system is fair, well, then the representative Black woman faces fair chances. And so there's a kind of just this neat way where I feel like this way of thinking about things could kind of automatically learn an important lesson. With that said, let me jump now to some ways of coping with the other reference class problem. And what I'm going to do here is just basically the way that I think about this is, what are the features that we want to kind of include or think of as features that are relevant for this, for constructing representative individuals? One thing I haven't talked too much about yet is, we don't want to include irrelevant details, right? So it's important for the representative individuals to be kind of abstractly construed, so that it's meaningful to talk about probabilities for them, and that we also want them to have features that seem to be important ones for fairness. So what we don't want is, I don't think, is to be talking about whether people are science fiction fans or fantasy fans and things like this, because typically those don't really aren't thought of as relevant for fairness, at least in the kinds of contexts we're worried about. We're not really worried that the criminal justice system discriminates against people who like fantasy as opposed to science fiction or something like that. I bring this up because from what I can tell them, for the most part, fair machine learning, in fair machine learning, the categories that we equalize across are usually just kind of taken over from anti-discrimination law, which is fine. But when I look at that list, I tend to think everything on it looks like a good thing to control for, but it also seems to me to be incomplete. So one thing I'm interested in is thinking about okay, if we're going to be philosophical about it, we're going to come up with our own list of things we're going to care about. We're not limited to the ones that the law has happened to be sensitive to or whatever. We can include other things that aren't on that list. But to do that, we might need some kind of account. And so like here is just what I have next here, and I'll go through this quickly, is 3 accounts actually. They're not thought of as being in tension with each other. Instead, each you could think of as like a device for detecting a feature that you might want to include as being relevant. I'm not going to say that they're fully exhaustive, but they give us, I think, a little bit of an insight as to what we do want to include, and maybe in some sense negatively what we want to exclude, but we don't have like any principles that are like negative. We have only positive ones right now. Okay, so without further ado, here are the 3 accounts, like very quickly. The first one we call the causal account, and you might think that one thing that counts as a reason for something being treated as a feature of a representative individual is a feature that is associated with membership to a group that best explains or maybe adequately explains the unequal distribution of advantages and disadvantages in society. So it's just sort of like a causal account, right? So like this would arguably, very probably, I don't even know why I said that, this would like pick out things like race and gender, right? And now you might say, okay, why not just, causal account sounds good, why not just leave it at that? I think if I talk about the next 2 accounts, they might show why we might even want to include things that are not positive, not associated with these causal descriptions. And again, I also think that these can be quite tailored to context. So, I mean, just going back really quickly to my example of Cuban versus Latino, you know, within a specific context, we might have reasons to think that like really the really explanatory factor is like maybe more of a general thing of being like, for example, Latino as opposed to Cuban. Maybe it doesn't really matter whether I or the person in question was Cuban or Mexican or whatever. It's more that they were, you know, Latino or maybe Spanish speaking or something like this. Okay, but why not just go with the causal account and leave it at that? Here are 2 reasons, I think. The next account that I'm going to discuss, and the first version I'm going to give of it, I think is overbroad and people will probably not like, but then I'm going to try to rein it in a little bit, is the one that we call the psychological account. The psychological account takes a feature to account for the purposes of constructing representative individuals if it's associated with a group that people subjectively identify with. Now you might say, okay, well, like subjectively identify with, I mean, can't people subjectively identify as science fiction fans or philosophy professors? And these aren't the sorts of things that we really want to be taking seriously. I mean, let's just go back to the causal account. And here's how I think we can rein it in a little bit and give an example of why we want something that goes beyond the causal account and does have the subjective element or the psychological element. So just imagine with me a really simple hypothetical case where you've got like a timeline and maybe you have a group where from like this time to this time, the causal account would treat membership to that group as relevant because it's important and they're disadvantaged because of their group membership. But let's just then imagine that one day miraculously or over time through slow progress, things get corrected. But right after they get corrected, the people, I mean, first of all, they might not know that it's been corrected, but secondly, they might still have like a kind of, they might have like a, they might identify with a group in this particular kind of way, and they might have like a reasonable kind of sensitivity towards the treatment of that group. And we might think it important to make sure that we're not doing anything that might even look as biased against them, even though like, and probably in this kind of case, nobody would really know that it quite stopped yet in the way that I told the story. But it could be the case that basically the causal factors run out, but still we want to be careful about how we treat certain groups because of their history or the way that we kind of think that the way that they identify and the sensitivities they have are understandable because they reflect like a reasonable sensitivity about the group's political status at the time or something like that. Okay, so that's like why we might think that we need something a little bit that goes beyond the causal account. And then finally, we have this moralized account, which says, well, sometimes there's some factors that affect our judgment of certain kinds of inequalities having to do with people's chances that aren't really captured by the causal or psychological account and seem to have like a moral element to them. So without saying too much, again, I'm trying to be like very hands-off with making any actual judgments about anything. I tipped my hand as like maybe being someone who's like inclined to that broad liberal idea, but I also try to back away and say, I don't even need to have that in my argument, I don't think. so stepping away from like any particular judgments about like dessert and things like this, we might think that like, well, if you go back to in the handout or just your memory, the equalized odds formula, it segregates the risky people from the non-risky people. And it says within the risky group and the non-risky group, make sure people kind of have even chances in this kind of way. But it also says these don't have to be the same. Like the chances that a risky person faces of a certain outcome doesn't need to be the same as a non-risky person. And that, I think, flags something like the intuition that, for instance, many people will say it's better to let better to let a guilty person go than convict an innocent person, something like that. So sometimes we need to kind of add this. Sometimes I think to this stuff there is a moral dimension that we need to account for. And I think that sometimes we're okay saying that not only do things like people's race and gender matter, but also a certain kind of status, like, I don't know, being guilty of murder or something like that. Again, stepping away from any particular judgment about what's good or bad or what people are owed. Okay, so I think that kind of walks me through that walks us through everything that I have prepared for today. I guess just to kind of put a little bit of an end cap on this, hopefully I've convinced you that there's some problems we're thinking about here. And I've also hopefully given you an admittedly unfinished work in progress framework that I hope you could see might get us on track to actually solving these problems or coping with them, as I said. And ideally, again, just going back from what I said at the beginning of the talk, not only kind of lets people more or less keep on doing what they've been doing, but hopefully helps them better understand what they're doing and allow them to do it a little bit better. And I think that on that note, I should probably just let it go and open it up to Q&A because I think I went over it a little bit. So, yeah.
Clinton, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And I got a lot out of it. I don't know, I'm just not remembering exactly how Q&A can work with the participants. If the any of the participants would like to ask a question, you can, if you can raise your hand or make some kind of a send a message, I can allow you to talk. So I think that's how it'll work. So if anybody has any questions for the speaker, feel free to, as I don't see anybody at the moment, I'm going to ask a question. Oh, Patrick has a question. So I'm going to let Patrick ask his question. And then if there's time, I'll ask mine. Go ahead, Patrick.
I think it's quite interesting what you told us, but if we look from a computer science or mathematics perspective, are there some guidelines we can follow when we develop an AI, or what would you recommend those people? Because I think in maybe most cases, the people developing the computer code have probably not a bad intention to do something unfair, but is there some catalog or guidelines these people could follow to check if they do something bad in the system?
Yeah, let me see if I can. So I think maybe one way to put the question is what I've said is like not very action guiding. It's like pretty abstract.
Yes.
More precise things I could say. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Let me see. I'll just kind of throw out a couple thoughts there. One, there's like, I have a couple and I'm not sure which one to start with. One is that, okay. So one thing that I think that you can do, so, okay, I know where I'll start, or I'll just commit to a starting point. So one thing that I think is true is that, and I think you would agree with this, that machine learning gets used in just countless different contexts, right? It could be hiring, it could be bail, it could be advertising, it could be all kinds of things. And one reason that I think that in general, it's one reason that I think it's hard to kind of come up with a general rubric for here's how you just kind of do this right, or here's like a good checklist, is that I personally think that what is really required from fairness in each of those arenas might be different. Like the way that you treat a potential customer versus a potential employee is just different, right? Or if you're selling a house, right? Like, or renting to a person, different kinds of, it's just kind of different arenas. And so one thing that I think is hard to say as a general matter, one reason it's hard for me to say, here's like a rubric, is that you might think that those arenas all have their kind of own special rules. And also like within different contexts, maybe if we were like in different countries or something, different kind of social histories that give rise to different sorts of things that we should be sensitive to. But that sounds to me like a defense of just being not as helpful. So here are like two other things that I think we could do. One is, I think if we take this approach, I mean, here's a couple of things that we could do that's a little bit more actionable. I mean, I think that one thing we can do is try and take this approach of like representative individuals. We could say like, well, like one exercise I think you could do is think about the people facing the system and try to think about what their representatives should look like, and just think, okay, given my understanding of the context and the people who might face this, do each of the representatives have crummy chances or okay chances of being treated right? Like if I was in their shoes, would I accept this? This is kind of like almost like a golden rule sort of thing. And I think that like if you use that, I think that actually like a lot of people could use that in a pretty user-friendly way. And that's like less of a list of here's what to do and more of kind of like here's a way to think about this on your own. And one thing that I'll just kind of throw out there that I think might converge on what that would say, people could look at, I'm sorry that I won't go through the whole thing because it's their own proposal, but I would bet that people here know Cathy O'Neill. Maybe at least some people have heard Cathy O'Neill. She wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction. It's a popular kind of book about things like what I'm talking about. She co-wrote a paper with a philosopher, Hannah Gunn, about something that they call the ethical matrix. And the ethical matrix is like, I don't know if I want to go through all the details just because I don't want to test people's patience, but it's a way of kind of constructing a grid that I think gets at similar things as what I'm talking about, where you think about like the columns are different constituencies, you know, guilty people, non-guilty people, maybe you can identify other groups. And then the rows are different kinds of values, people's freedom, people's happiness, these sorts of things. And then what you try to do is just kind of go through each cell and think about, are we doing okay from this perspective? And you can kind of treat it like as a checklist. And you can also probably look up, like, I mean, there's a Wikipedia page that's actually, I think, pretty good of all of many different fairness measures. And you might kind of look at those, I think, not as like, okay, here's everything I need to do, because actually you can't do them all at the same time. Something I brought up was that they're kind of in tension with each other, but you can look at them each as like a little bit of you could look at each one and say like, okay, what's this asking for? Is my system like doing something disastrous in that respect or not? Can I defend how it breaks that rule or something? But I don't know if I can kind of come up with a checklist a lot, because I think that just what you want to give people in these contexts are so different that it's kind of hard to do it. I mean, one way to put it, and then I'll let Debbie jump in. One way that I think I would put it is that like you could use machine learning to do almost anything, and I don't think that like really, like every semester I teach a semester-long introductory class to ethics, and if you think that what you could do with fair machine learning is almost as diverse as like what you could do, I don't think I could say like, here's just ethics in 10 bullet points. And I think similarly with data science, just the power of machine learning, it allows you to work and do so many different things in so many different contexts. It's hard, I think, to give like pre-baked advice as opposed to like maybe an exercise to develop your own advice. But I don't know, that's just a quick thought. And that's also kind of coming from somebody who has the luxury of not having to solve problems like on a project with we have to have the system roll out by now. I can like sit and speculate forever and just think about philosophy. So I do appreciate the kind of like idea that like, okay, but like what can we do now? So anyhow, I probably went on too long. Maybe I'll see if there's follow-ups or other questions.
Thank you.
So Clinton, I apologize for my terrible internet connection. So it struck me that what you've provided us is a really nice way to also think about explainability. And so like many people like know about this demand, like we want we want to be able, like AI must be explainable, right? We must be able, that's one of the, like the decision, think about that, right? Is to say, well, one way I can explain a decision, and by explanation, you also mean justification. One of the ways I can justify the decision to you is via this like representative model, which I think you did a great job explaining. So like, this is an option or a way for us to think about explanation as justification via the social. But I wondered whether somebody, or what you might say to somebody is like, well, and this goes back to the other representative what was the other
reference class?
The other reference class. Well, I don't want, that's not my, so if you like, well, you know, all white women were treated the same, had equal risks of being, you know, treated badly. So like I don't recognize myself via the representative you've assigned me, which is already, it seems like inherent in the problem that you specified. So it's a certain kind of liberalism and justifications about their social institutions, and we owe them that. That's the very broad liberalism. And another form of liberalism says, like, you're going to have to understand yourself in terms of some kind of representation, social group representation. What if I just don't, I'm like, that doesn't count as a justification or explanation for me. I don't recognize myself in the group that you're putting me in. And maybe that's just too hard, but I'm just curious what you might say to that.
Yeah, well, let me say two things, because it's fun. The explainability point, I think, is like kind of a neat thing that I want to remember, like, about as like a feature here. I think that's like really helpful, because and just kind of a neat and helpful thing for me to be aware of, because and it maybe, if I could say just really briefly, probably to especially like non-philosophers, is one thing that I think is important is that people get treated fairly. But another thing is that I think there's different ways of putting this, but that people understand how they're being treated, that they kind of have a grip on what's happening to them, that they have maybe some agency, or that they're at least given enough tools to exercise their agency, because it's not enough to know that I've been treated fairly. It's not enough to have been treated fairly, but maybe it's really important also to understand that I've been treated fairly, or just to understand how I've been treated. For example, if I want to appeal the decision or something else, right? There's actually a really interesting case where people, when they talk about compass, usually talk about the unfairness stuff, but there's another conversation that's kind of interesting in cases where actually there was a court case involving a white defendant where the idea was less that he had been discriminated against, but more that he just like didn't have an understanding of what had happened to him in a certain kind of way, that his sentence wasn't individualized, that he didn't have enough of a grip on like how it worked, that the system hadn't been validated for his situation, these sorts of things. And you might think like, yeah, if someone wants to appeal a computer making an important decision about you, you have to have a sense of how it's working, or how it, like something like this. So the explainability issue is an interesting one. I didn't think about it, but I do think it is, I even said it is a good explanation. It is a user-friendly explanation, I hope. So that's neat. But on to the harder problem, the other reference class problem thing. Maybe what I think I can say some things that are like totally like absorb your point, because I think that's actually something that I thought about a little bit. For one, okay, so maybe I'll have to like kind of out myself as like, when it goes to probability stuff, of being a pretty subjective person. So like one thing that I think is true when it comes to things like the reference class problem, you oftentimes, there just is some latitude, you just make a choice. So like the correct color language, just there might not be a true color language. They're just, you kind of have to live with a little bit of subjective choice or arbitrary choice or something like this. And similarly with the other reference class problem, I think we want a way of kind of ruling some stuff out, ruling some stuff in, but beyond that, I might be flexible. And one thing that I think you could accommodate, at least in principle, is people's objection to saying like, no, that's just like, that doesn't describe me, or something like this. And I think that there's kind of a couple things you can do there. One is that like kind of relating this to other bigger things like you did with the explainability thing, is you might think that, you know, this isn't something that necessarily people have to do, like, especially with like maybe a big thing that might be like, you know, bail, like how the whole country's going to allocate bail. You might think that like you don't just have a group of statisticians build the system, but you also have people, you also have them talk to people about how they're being represented in the system and have a little bit of a back and forth there. So like one way to think about this is to like actually listen to people's objections and seeing if you can accommodate them. And that kind of goes along with my spirit of, like, I brought up the kind of subjective thing because you might think that like, okay, well, there's some wiggle room. There's like a little bit of a give and pull, a little bit that you can take there to accommodate these things. Because like when it comes down to it, I mean, one example I didn't use in the talk that I almost did was like Hispanic versus Latino. Like at some point, those are not identical categories. They overlap a ton, and you might think that in a given context, there might not be like a ton to say in terms of like which one of those is absolutely correct as opposed to the other ones, independent of, okay, which one do people prefer or something like this. Maybe either one would work, if that makes sense. So I think that there's, I mean, do I have a way of saying, let's say somebody just like doesn't want to play ball and say that I'm a singular individual, don't put me in any categories or something like this. I might be able to say, I don't know if I can say anything to that person, but I do think that there's a lot of wiggle room to accommodate lots of objections. And perhaps like a totally fair system is not just one that treats people fairly in a certain kind of way, but also like gives people agency and listens to how they categorize themselves. And there's no, like, the idea here is not for me to give one method for constructing representative individuals. In fact, sorry, I'm kind of going on here, but one thing that could be interesting as an alternative approach is to do something procedural. Instead of saying, here are the ways to identify features for representative individuals, you say, okay, well then meet with the population and have a conversation about how to abstractly construct individuals with them and have a more kind of a democratic process, in which case it's at least harder to imagine someone objecting because they've had some influence on how they've been categorized or something. Now, of course, you know, you can't always do that. That's kind of an idealistic thing to do. But I guess like the one thing I want to focus on is that I think that there's like a lot of wiggle room that can accommodate objections that doesn't say, here's the right answer, you're wrong, you know, or whatever. But instead says like, okay, yeah, like if someone has an objection, maybe we could work it into the system and accommodate it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that totally gets all your concerns, but I think that there's a lot.
No. And we are out of time, but somebody wrote in and I think they had to go, but I do want to get an answer to them if we could. And part of, they ask for any AI to be fair, would this require, I take it, a lot of manual work to classify all of the factors that might make it unfair? And I thought that this sort of connected. So if you could say like really briefly, like what kind of, like who is doing that work to classify the people, and then also creating the models and then checking them, like where does that work occur? And, you know, like, I don't know what, I take it manual refers to like just having people make those judgment calls.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that, and I also would assume that somebody has like thought about this. I mean, I think that there's probably a number of ways of thinking about it. I mean, I, for one, have done a lot of consulting with people that work on these sorts of things, and you might have a day. I mean, I can think of a couple different models. Like, I thought about this a little bit. I mean, you might create like an entity that just does these audits, and like, here we are building this system, and we, you know, call up the entity to audit us, help us through this, maybe check our system. Or maybe when you're building the system, you have an ethicist on your team. That's becoming a common thing, who could like help advise you. Another thing I've thought about is, you know, more and more including a kind of ethics component to data science education, things like this, where people will have a sense of how to do these things. And maybe relating to the first question, I think that we already have something of a practice here. There's already, I mean, I don't think that anyone has like the true rubric of how to do this stuff correctly, but there's some pretty established practices of like measures that people tend to like think are okay and factors that they think are important to look at. And even further, there's other algorithms that will purport to, if you build your system in a certain way, will end up creating an algorithm that complies with a certain kind of fairness measure. So I mean, I think that there's like just a huge number of ways. I mean, maybe some kind of best practices, maybe having ethicists there in the beginning, maybe have a more deliberative process that would probably be a lot more difficult. maybe having an outside firm, maybe, you know, working on this stuff as its own. I mean, there's a huge community of people who work on this stuff. It's a whole field now, and maybe just incorporating what they tend to think are the best practices into like the way people operate, into data science education. Like, I think there's just like any number of ways you can kind of get this work done. And I think that for the most part, what I'm saying, again, I think aligns with a lot of these practices. So like, okay, like take a look at race and gender and these sorts of things. It's already been done. It's already being done. I think a lot of it's like fairly intuitive, like what we want to look out for, at least in a lot of cases. So I don't know, that was kind of all over the place, but hopefully like kind of sketches like different ways in which you might try to actually accomplish the sorts of things I'm talking about.
Well, I have to thank you very much for your talk, and I think your handout was super helpful, so I'm very glad that we had that.
Cool.
And the links there were really interesting. This will be available on the Stellar Group's YouTube page, and the Ethics Institute will also distribute it. So I will get a copy to you, Clinton, and I want to thank everybody, including Patrick, my co-host for this series. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you for this nice talk.